everyone's information. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar. This is the second in our series of 3 conversations about changes to the Canadian Environmental Protection Act to protect vulnerable populations from hazardous chemicals. The title of today's session is, Are Vulnerable Populations Protected from Hazardous Chemicals in Canada? Why a New Approach is Needed. My name is April Wepler, and I am the Engagement Coordinator here at the Canadian Environmental Law Association, or CELA. My colleague Faye is also on the line with us, and Faye is a researcher and paralegal with CELA, and I'll be introducing our speakers in just a moment. I want to start off with some housekeeping about Zoom for everyone. We are hosting our session today in Zoom meeting, which is a little different for some who may have joined us in the past when we're doing a Zoom webinar. So this is a slightly different platform. So we're asking that all of you keep your video cameras turned off and your microphones muted for the sake of the session today. We are going to be recording the entire session and posting it to our website after the session today. We'll also post the presenter slide decks, so you'll have access to those as well. Hopefully we won't have any challenges with the audio quality. If you accidentally unmute your line and don't realize it, I may have to mute you. So apologies ahead of time if I have to do that to anyone. Throughout the session, feel free to ask questions in the chat box, and you're welcome to do that at any time, and you're welcome to do that in your own language as well if you prefer. We have a number of translators on the line who may say a few words in a moment. So you're welcome to do that in the chat box at any time. We'll be answering most of the questions in the discussion time that will happen after our presentations today. So depending on how much time we have, we may invite you to unmute your microphone and elaborate on your question. But for now, let's focus on keeping questions in the chat box. And if we have lots of time at the end, we can do something different. So before I tell you more about our webinar and our speakers today, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm calling in from Guelph, which is situated on the ancestral homelands of the Anishinaabeg peoples, specifically the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the 6 Nations of the Grand Watershed. And I'll tell you a little bit more about CELA if you're not familiar with us. We are a specialty legal clinic within the Ontario-wide network of clinics funded by Legal Aid Ontario. And we work to protect human health and our environment by seeking justice for those harmed by pollution and by working to change policies to prevent such problems in the first place. As a legal aid clinic, our top priority is to represent low-income individuals and communities and to speak up for those with less influence in the decision-making process. CELA's work for environmental law protection and reform is fundamental to social justice because the people who are most impacted by air pollution, unsafe water, or contaminated land are often the least able to avoid such threats. And as a legal aid clinic, we are uniquely positioned to partner with our sister clinics, other service providers, health partners, and educators to advance those really important reforms. And I'll just add that this year, CELA is celebrating our 50th anniversary. And this is a critical time. We can't let down our guard. Environmental laws are under attack in Ontario, and even the Ontario legal aid system itself has been threatened with ill-advised reform ideas over the last year. We hope that you'll want to stay engaged with CELA beyond our conversation today and pay attention to these important issues, help us to speak out for vulnerable populations, and call for stronger environmental protection laws. So we'll be putting a link to our website at the end of the webinar today, and also a link to our newsletter where you can stay informed about webinars like these. I'll just introduce the 2 other speakers we have on the line. In addition to myself and Faye, we have Anne Rochon Ford, who is the project co-lead for the Nail Salon Workers Project at the Parkdale Queen West Community Health Center. And we also have Bev Thorpe. And I apologize, Bev, I don't have your title on my intro sheet here. So maybe I'll let you do that yourself when we get to your presentation. My apologies, Bev.
Can anybody hear me? It's Gordon Delzell. I'm signed on as well.
Hi, Gord. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you.
We're just going to ask everyone to mute their microphones for now.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks. So before we get into the agenda and before I pass the microphone over to Anne, I just wanted to pause and give the peer outreach workers who may be on the line with the Parkdale Queen West Community Health Center an opportunity to translate any portion of my introduction if they would like to. So if anybody wants to, you're welcome to unmute your line and offer that translation if you'd like. And is there anyone's microphone that I should unmute? They should be able to do it themselves, but.
No, I think they probably know whether they need to translate based
Okay.
on who's on. Yeah.
Okay,
Thanks.
great. Okay, so we'll just wait another moment in case anyone wants to do that.
You can unmute my speaker there.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, with that, I will pass the virtual mic over to Anne. I'm just going to stop screen sharing, Anne, so that you can share your slides.
Okay. Okay.
Looks great.
I can remove the people view here so that I can see my full screen, right?
Sure.
Is that
Yeah.
under show grid video? Or just?
You should be able to just drag and move it out of the way as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great.
Thank you, April, and welcome everyone. I will jump right in because there's a lot to talk about today. But just to give some context, if we're going to be talking about whether or not vulnerable populations are protected by our legislation, we need to know what the legislation is. And I apologize in advance to people who are more than familiar with this act and with how the government works at the federal government level, because I will be assuming that some people don't. So the Canadian Environmental Protection Act is sort of the foundational piece of legislation that is, as I say here, aimed at preventing pollution and protecting the environment and human health with a goal of sustainable development. And it has been around, it was enacted in 1988, and it goes under periodic reviews. The version we're working with right now is from 1999. And in 2016-17, another review was done, and the Standing Committee on Environmental and Sustainable Development released an important report called Healthy Environment, Healthy Economy, Strengthening the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. And that, that document was an important kind of turning point in terms of there was some acknowledgement that vulnerable populations are disproportionately affected by pollution and toxics. So that was good to see. But in terms of what I'm going to be talking about a little bit more today, it included very little about workers and toxic exposures. So the government responded to that report. Just to remind, this is the legislation, so that's what happens at the parliamentary level. But then the government, the government body responded to that in 2018, and again reiterated interest and concern about vulnerable populations. But we haven't yet seen anything happen in terms of changes to the act. We're hoping for something late 2020 or early 2021, but COVID has thrown a wrench into everything, so we'll see when that actually happens. So as I said, that was the piece that Parliament is responsible for, and the piece that the government is responsible for underneath the what we'll call SEPA now is the Chemicals Management Plan. And that also is aimed at reducing the risk posed by chemicals to Canadians and their environment. It was established in 2006, and it was set up to address 4,300 chemical substances identified as priorities. It is nearing its completion. It was supposed to have completed for 2020, but once again, things have been delayed and we don't actually know exactly where it's at. That is the government body. So the bureaucrats who are responsible for implementing the act with respect to how chemicals are managed, it happens at this level. And this is a joint initiative of Health Canada and Environment Canada. It's really only begun to consider vulnerable populations in how it assesses chemicals and how it presents its management plans, which has been disappointing for a lot of us. We've been pushing for more recognition much earlier on. We did make some headway a couple of years ago in organizing a panel for government officials and for these stakeholder advisory council that included representatives from what we would consider vulnerable populations. So firefighters, First Nations advocate living in a polluted community, a nail salon worker, a housing advocate living in subsidized housing, and individuals living with chemical sensitivity. The chemicals management plan, to many of our disappointment, however, does not consider workers. So it doesn't consider the occupational realm when it does its assessments of chemicals that it's reviewing. So just to get into the weeds a bit here about what vulnerable populations are, Health Canada has defined this as a group of individuals within the Canadian population who, due to greater susceptibility and or greater exposure, may be at increased risk of experiencing adverse health effects from exposure to chemicals. And in May 2019, Health Canada presented a framework to the Chemicals Management Plan on vulnerable populations, noting that they wish to ensure that a renewed chemicals management program, which was supposed to happen this year, would adequately consider populations at increased risk. And as I said, we haven't seen any indication of that happening yet. I think that CELA did a more comprehensive job. The Canadian Environmental Law Association did a more comprehensive job of defining vulnerable populations. In their submission to amendments to CEPA that they submitted to the federal government, they define general vulnerable populations as infants, children, adolescents, women, including pregnant women, seniors, Indigenous peoples, individuals with pre-existing medical conditions, workers that work with a toxic substance, or by reason of their, and here we get into real legalese, reason of their income, race, color, gender, national origin, or geographic location, are subject to disproportionate potential for exposure to or potential for disproportionate adverse effects from exposure to a substance, including a toxic substance, a priority toxic substance, or a substance of very high concern. And that's terminology that's used by the Chemicals Management Plan and how they assess products, chemicals. So to have a bit better understanding of whether or not our federal government is protecting vulnerable populations, we thought we would look at one community in particular, one group of workers. It's one that I know fairly well, working for the last 7 or 8 years with Parkdale Queen West Community Health Center and previously York University on a project working with nail salon workers in the Greater Toronto area. They, I feel, are very clearly fall under the category of a vulnerable population. Just by way of a bit of background, they're a rapidly growing sector. A high percentage of them are new immigrants and foreign students. It's a highly racialized community, largely Asian. There are many language barriers. There are many violations of employment standards within this sector. And they are largely trained on the job, making them more vulnerable to owners' whims. And city-based inspections, which are handled through a division of Toronto Public Health, are intended to protect the customer, not the workers. And that's a really important distinction. Their mandate is to ensure that customers aren't being harmed in nail salons. There's nothing, sometimes there's some spin-off effect that is helpful to nail salon workers, but that isn't their mandate. And, you know, obviously it's important that customers be protected against any harms of various sorts, but there isn't really a body that oversees the protection of the mostly women who work there. And that's a real concern because, as I'll show in a minute, they are exposed to an inordinate number of problematic chemicals. One nail technician in one of the focus groups we ran a number of years ago said, customers do not care about the health impacts of the product they're using. They simply want nice nails at a good price. So just to give you a bit of a sense of what chemicals we're talking about that are sort of the stock and trade of a nail salon worker's day at work. I've only listed a few here. There are many more, but these are some of the more common ones: formaldehyde, toluene, dibutyl phthalates, parabens, acrylamides, methanol, triphenyl phosphate. And importantly, in the third column to the right, these and the literature supporting this, the academic literature supporting this, is in a reference I'll give at the end. So we're looking at carcinogens, endocrine disruptors, reproductive toxins. A number of them, as you can see, are endocrine disruptors. So real concern about what they are exposed to daily in their work. I highlighted the bottom one because Bev in her talk is going to be talking about regrettable substitutes, and triphenyl phosphate has been something that is supposed to have replaced dibutyl phthalate, which we know causes problems, but it in itself is a problem chemical. So Bev will get into that a little bit more. So we know from the previous slide what the academic scientific literature is saying about their work exposures. But when we asked back in a series of focus groups we did in 2014, when we asked nail salon workers themselves what they experienced, what kind of health problems they experienced, we got quite a range, including skin rashes, allergies, musculoskeletal issues, burning eyes, throat, breathing problems, coughing, sleep issues, upset stomach, concerns about pregnancy, and exposure. So that's just what they articulated that they have experienced. That's not even getting into what we actually know from the literature are health problems. So on the left is one example of some of the resources that we've produced to try and raise awareness in the nail salon community about some of the health issues that they potentially face because of their toxic exposures. So on top of these chemical exposures that they're dealing with daily, they have additional vulnerabilities. So the federal government doesn't require that products that are sold for professional use include ingredients on product labels. So you'll notice if you look at most bottles of nail polish, that you won't get a listing of ingredients. You won't get a listing of ingredients in most of the things that you would find in a nail salon unless they've bought it in an industrial quantity. The chemicals management plan assesses chemicals one at a time. It doesn't look at mixtures of chemicals, but we know that the reality for a nail salon worker is that they're exposed to many chemicals at once, not just one. So we don't have that picture. What does mixing this chemical with that chemical in the air or in their actual use, what is the impact on health? And because of the small size of most nail salons, and I'm talking in particular about discount salons, the employers are not required to pay into Workplace Safety and Insurance Board. So in addition to not being unionized, they have very little external protection other than some wonderful NGOs like the Workers' Action Center and small legal clinics that work with nail technicians. They have very little protection, unlike others who work in larger sectors that are either unionized or are covered by WSIB. And then an additional problem with this sector is that everything that oversees the work that they do, their daily environment, is covered by 3 different levels of government. So often it's hard to know, if you're having a problem, say, with ventilation, and what do I need to do with respect to ventilation? A nail salon owner is expected to know, oh, well, you go to the provincial government for that because they oversee occupational health and safety. Or if there's a complaint to be registered, if a customer has a complaint, for example, they don't necessarily know which level of government they're supposed to go to. So the federal government oversees the regulation of chemicals side, what we're talking about today. The provincial government, I'm speaking very broad strokes here, oversees occupational health and safety and some inspection. And the municipal government oversees inspection of salons and licensing. So because of that, you see a lot of falling between the cracks when there are problems in nail salons that need to be dealt with, reported, of just knowing which level to go through. And sometimes there's also, we've experienced this directly, some passing the buck. You go to one level of government and they say, oh, no, 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 that's not our territory. You should go to, you know, X, Y, and Z in the other level of government. So, so that's sort of very, very, very brief picture of what nail salon workers are dealing with, nail salon owners are dealing with. And then along comes COVID-19 to throw another wrench into what is already a difficult work life. So in addition to the toxic load from their workplace exposures, they now have to enhance their cleaning and disinfecting initially in order to open their salons back in June, I think it was, and now to keep them open. So this is happening in the context where some owners can barely make their rent. Keep in mind, they've been closed. They were closed for several months, so we're not having any income. Their business is down. They have a new added wrinkle of anti-Asian racism being on the rise. That's been very well documented and a huge problem in terms of how people are viewing Asians in this workforce. They must, in some cases, retrofit their salons, purchase more PPE and products, plexiglass to put between customers and themselves. And all of this in the context of having very little support that's been offered for this category of workers, which is personal service sector workers. So many of them, for example, didn't qualify for CERB or EI. There weren't specific grants to help them purchase PPE and other retrofitting products like plexiglass that some other industries benefited from. So again, kind of falling between the cracks. Last month, we carried out, just trying to get a bit of a sense of where things were at with salons in the in the Greater Toronto area with respect to reopening, because we had a lot of conversations with them by phone and in webinars while they were closed about what they were dealing with and their concerns about reopening and what they had to do. So once they were reopened last month, we did a brief survey, just 23 salon owners and technicians, but fairly in depth. And no surprise, we found out that a majority of them, owners and technicians, are worried about COVID-19, specifically because they're getting less business, so they have less income coming in due to COVID. Customers aren't respecting distancing or masking rules. We've even heard stories of customers threatening lawsuits because they won't serve them because they don't have a mask on, when in fact the owner or technician is doing the right thing by not serving them or by trying to accommodate them at the end of the day. They have new costs that they didn't have before of personal protective equipment, disinfecting and cleaning products. And the majority of salon owners said that their cleaning and disinfecting had changed. No surprise there again, since the beginning of COVID. When we asked them if they knew that cleaning and disinfecting products can cause health issues such as asthma and skin problems, and this is something that we've talked about a lot in our workshops in the salons. We have a whole section on respiratory problems caused by the nail salon products, skin problems caused by the nail salon products. So there is some heightened awareness about, chemical impact on their individual health. Roughly only half were aware that the cleaning products now and the disinfecting products that they're having to use were also a problem. We hate being the bearers of bad news, but that is the reality. And as one of the interviewees said, I know, but what can you do? When we asked what they're using to clean and disinfect and how and where they're using these products, because some of this is new applications, we found that a majority were using bleach and other products containing problematic chemicals such as quaternary ammonium compounds or quats. But again, we heard, they're doing the best they can. And as one said, I have a hard time understanding the best product to use. We were told that they buy large quantities of bleach and alcohol and put these into smaller bottles. which, you know, makes sense. But in fact, in doing that kind of transfer, you're releasing all kinds of compounds into the air that are very problematic for, in particular, respiratory and skin health. Most of them are also using, in larger amounts, alcohol sprays and wipes and Lysol sprays and wipes, which are somewhat less problematic than bleach and quats, but still of some concern, given that they're using these all day. They're also using these, as many of us are also using these at home. So we're talking about ongoing, kind of relentless exposure to these chemicals. We asked them what would be the greatest help to them through the pandemic. And they told us support for personal protective equipment, especially masks for themselves, for owners and technicians, financial support. There hasn't been much coming their way. Rent support, again. They need more business. They need more training for nail technicians, and they'd like to know which products are more safe to use. So what we're doing as a result of this survey that we did is we're producing some resources and a webinar for nail technicians and salon owners about safer products that they can use and why some of the ones that are in popular use are potentially problematic for their health. And one other comment we heard that was interesting: technicians need to be protected from working 10-hour days, because many of them do, just to make a living. So in a nutshell, to get back to what we set out here to ask, is our federal legislation protecting vulnerable populations? I think if we look at nail technicians as kind of emblematic of a vulnerable population, whether it's the minefield of chemicals found in everyday nail products or the chemicals they're now using to clean and disinfect, this group and many other vulnerable groups, and Bev will touch on that a bit, are not being protected. The system is broken. There is harm to their health, and it is constant. If the Canadian Environmental Protection Act is aimed at, quote, protecting the environment and human health, this is simply not happening for vulnerable populations such as nail salon workers and many others. So before we get too gloom and doomy, what needs to happen? Change is possible. We have, and I think one of the things that keeps us going in our Toronto group is that we see change happening in other jurisdictions, mostly in the States, a lot of it in California, some good things in Europe as well. So for example, we've seen that a law was just passed in California banning 24 chemicals found in cosmetics, including many of the chemicals found in the nail salon workers' toolkit. And that was the result of a lot of NGOs lobbying, people working as advocates for nail technicians and beauty salon workers were there at the state capitol, arguing, fighting, making their case, and they got a law passed, which will go into effect in, I think, 2024. So for us in Canada, there is an opportunity for input. And I think if we connect with organizations like CELA, Canadian Environmental Law Association, Environmental Defense, eco-justice groups like that, who are working at the ground around these issues, there is an opportunity to have input to this legislation and to, when we see what comes out, to respond to it, to make sure that vulnerable workers are prioritized, that occupational exposures are considered in the assessments and plans that are coming out of the chemicals management plans, and that safe substitutions for problematic chemicals are also prioritized. So just to wrap, prevention is key. Ostensibly, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act is committed to preventing pollution and protecting the environment and human health. We need to uphold legislators to that commitment. We need to remind them of it repeatedly. And with respect to vulnerable population, prevention is currently not in place, so we need to push for that. If you want some more information about the nail salon workers and our Toronto project, this book was just published this year, and I have a chapter in it that gives an overview of our Toronto project. And in that, there are many, many of the references, the academic references that made up that earlier chart that I referenced. And my email is there. If you don't want to get a copy of the book, and I don't blame you, academic books are expensive, I'm happy to send you a PDF of my chapter. My email is right there. In addition, for more on vulnerable populations and the work that CELA has done around this with respect to SEPA, last year we did a workshop where we talked with vulnerable workers from the nail salon industry, from the firefighters, border crossing workers, and a group of people who worked in plastics manufacturing. And that is up online at this URL at the bottom of the screen. That's it. So I think we're holding questions until Bev has completed her presentation. Is that right?
Yep. Yep. So I see a number of great questions in the chat box. You can keep those coming and we'll take all of those when Bev is done. Yeah. So Bev, if you want to go ahead and unmute and share your screen, you're welcome to do that.
Hi, everyone.
Looks great.
Yeah, except that's not my first screen. I'll just stop share for a second while I fix it. Okay, be with you in a second. All right, slideshow. Hopefully this will work. Okay. Right. Nice to see you all. And I'll just move right in. Anne was very granular and very pragmatic and very to the point about vulnerable populations and nail salons. I'm going to take us a little bit higher up and talk about the substitution principle and why we need it as the core in the new revised SEPA to help protect vulnerable populations. So I'll give a little bit of an overview of what that is, the substitution principle, and then I'm going to use 3 examples, the PFAS chemicals, flame retardants, and PERC, to just demonstrate how we're not doing as good a job as we could within SEPA and other regulatory authorities. I won't go into a lot of detail about substitution frameworks and strategies. These have been covered last year in a previous blog and webinar, so do click on there. Thank you. So substitution principle. As the name implies, it places the substitution as the priority response to hazardous chemicals, not on trying to control releases or exposure to hazardous chemicals, but it asks, is it needed in the first place, and what is out there that's safer? Unfortunately, we don't have that focus within our Canadian regulations on chemicals management. We tend to be much more reduce exposure and try to do a lot more risk management rather than go right to the hazard and say, is there something of less hazard for that function? And this nice definition at the bottom is the substitution principle has been around for quite a while. And I like this one from Okapol in Germany from 17 years ago now, that just emphasizes it's not necessarily a chemical replacement to a hazardous chemical. It could be achieved by product design or other measures to achieve the function of what that chemical is doing. So it's very innovative in its big thinking. So what is informed substitution? You need to know if the alternative is safer. And that is exactly what, because it is a solutions-oriented approach, you need to do an alternatives assessment to identify, are they available? What is the hazard of the alternative, the health and safety hazards? Obviously, there's going to be potential trade-offs. Is it technically and economically feasible, et cetera, et cetera. So there's many different types of alternative assessment frameworks. But the goal really, and this is why it's called informed substitution, is to prevent regrettable substitutes, which are simply replacing one hazardous chemical with something of equal or higher hazards. And as Anne detailed, vulnerable populations, just to summarize that, include communities and people who are exposed to chemicals in their workplaces, low-income communities, fence line neighborhoods, communities that rely on subsistence for at least a portion of their diet, such as Indigenous people of the North, and of course, infants, children, and pregnant women who are particularly at risk from hormone disrupting chemicals. And just to emphasize, usually vulnerable populations have a higher cumulative impact from hazardous chemicals. And there's been a lot of interesting work that's been happening on how to raise the voice of vulnerable populations in alternatives assessment frameworks. This is a nice report from NRDC in the States that really explored this whole deal about when you are looking at alternatives, the Commons principles for alternatives assessment emphasizes that you need to require disclosure and transparency on your decision-making process for when you are going to promote something that's safer, but you need to also make very transparent the assumptions that you're making and what kind of decision-making rules that are applied. And bringing in the fact that we need to give higher weight to vulnerable populations and actually involve them in decision making is something that you're seeing a lot more push on within the alternatives assessment community. Great report. If you want to have a look at it, I highly recommend it. So let's go into a few examples, 3 examples. We'll start off with the good old flame retardant chemicals, the PBDEs, and vulnerable populations. Many of you know a lot about this class. They're global pollutants due to their widespread use in polyurethane foam, carpets, electronic equipment, building materials, etc. They're found widely in household dust. All Canadian populations contain some type of PBDEs in our blood or in our system. And this is because this has been monitored. I sometimes say we monitor ourselves to death in Canada. We know they're a problem, but what the focus needs to be now is, are they needed? New standards for flammability are coming through that stipulate you don't need chemical flame retardants. But what I wanted to highlight is that they're known chemicals of high concern with direct impact on IQ and neurotoxicity, particularly in children. And here we have declared PBDEs as toxic, but products with PBDEs are allowed for sale in Canada. Considering that dust is one of our main exposures from consumer products, this sounds almost more than irrational. However, this is the setup of SEPA right now. So we have this massive loophole where many exemptions exist, even though they've been declared SEPA toxic, and these regulations do not apply to consumer products or parts of products such as foam. Nice report from those of you that know the Endocrine Disruption Action Group, compilation of researchers from various universities in Canada that do point out, and I like this emphasis that they put in the report, that exposures to toxic flame retardants are an environmental justice problem as well as a reproductive justice issue. And as they point out, the people most at risk are pregnant women, fetuses, infants, and children, with infants from the age of just born to 6 months with the greatest exposure to flame retardants. And it's not just a health and justice issue, it's costing us a lot of money. This study that was done 5 years ago in Europe tried to assess the economic impact of using hormone disrupting chemicals. They came up with this 150 billion euros a year in Europe. And one of the things they highlighted was the weight of evidence of how much different types of hormone disrupting chemicals were costing. 70 to 100% likelihood that IQ loss and intellectual disability tied to PBDEs found in flame retardants, as well as the organophosphates, herbicides and insecticides. But keep that in mind, that is a real problem with our health impact of how these children are going to grow up. Other vulnerable populations, obviously workers, yet again, workers in e-waste recycling, dust exposure, air exposure, workers in facilities applying flame retardants to products. Who is manufacturing polyurethane foam with different types of flame retardants? Communities near dump sites. What's happening to fence line communities, not just dump sites, but I would also emphasize incineration sites where because of the brominated nature of these compounds, if insufficient burning, bad burning, just incineration generally, you are going to get brominated dioxins. So it's the taking a life cycle perspective, who along that whole product chain is going to be impacted. And of course, indigenous communities in the Arctic, PBDEs in the food chain, because they are persistent, the bioaccumulate up. If you are top of the food chain, eating seal, eating whale, eating local food, you are going to get a bigger exposure to this stuff. And as a report that was done on Inuit children in childcare centers in Nunavik found that PBDE levels were higher than those observed in many children and adolescents around the world. Do safer alternatives to PBDEs exist? Yes. Lots of work done on flame retardancy in different types of design change in furniture and fabrics. New labeling that came through from California that allows this very informative label for consumers to turn up the cushion on their sofa and see if it's labeled as contain no added flame retardant chemicals. In the electronic sector, there's been a movement for years now to move away from bromine and chlorine. All the main computer manufacturers are have successfully achieved that, and on and on. The point being that there are alternatives out there. And how are we promoting this type of innovation in our market, in our economy in Canada? So let's move to per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, PFAS. Many vulnerable populations here. 98% of Canadians have PFAS in our systems, but some are more exposed than others, of course. Firefighters are a big cohort that have not just have been exposed to PFAS and firefighting foam for many years. And in fact, a study that was done earlier, not quite recently, found that female firefighters in San Francisco had faced higher exposure to PFAS carcinogens than women working in offices. And women in offices, of course, would be exposed through PFAS in the from furniture, in dust, could be in cosmetics they use. The main thing here is that obviously this was quite groundbreaking to find, particularly for female firefighters. This study came out earlier this year. And then just recently in June, an assessment of firefighting gear, their turnout gear, the clothes they actually wear. Their firefighters have traditionally had a higher cancer rate because of the different types of fumes that they're being exposed to, but people are really narrowing down on the PFAS. And then, of course, you have other vulnerable populations, again, workers. Who is working in the manufacturing plants that are coating PFAS on paper for food contact materials, for food packaging? Working in waterproofing the apparel and footwear and boots, carpets. And then, of course, again, taking that life cycle perspective, the recycling processes for products with PFAS. If we want to bring in more textile recycling and carpet recycling, what happens when those products contain PFAS? You're going to get it in the dust, in the air, and again, workers facing more exposure. And yet again, our Indigenous communities in the north are at high risk from PFAS, not just PBDEs and other chemicals. This study that came through last month, pregnant Inuit women more exposed to the new PCBs, in other words, these PFAS chemicals, than other Canadians. It's interesting to also follow Philippe Grandjean's work on the effect of PFAS on reduced vaccine response in children. And He previously looked at children in the Faroe Islands and found that reduced immune response to 2 vaccinations and increased PFAS concentrations at age 18 months and 5 years. There was a correlation, but the associations were stronger, again, at infant level between ages of 3 and 6 months. According to Health Canada, they've done a lot of reporting on this. The main routes of exposure to PFAS for adults in Canada is by ingestion of food, drinking water, and house dust. And the main routes of exposure for infants, toddlers, and children is that hand-to-mouth contact with consumer products such as carpets, clothing, and upholstery. Health Canada, over a year ago, set drinking water guideline for PFAS at 1,000 parts per trillion, yet immunotoxicity in babies is at 1 part per trillion. Yet we have no product substitution policy, and so regrettable substitutes are flooding the market. Why is this? Well, the chemical industry's solution for the long chain PFAS, such as the PFOS and the PFOA, which were voluntarily pulled in the US and were restricted in Canada, was simply to substitute them with short chain PFAS, which are just as persistent and in fact very mobile in water systems. And yet they're allowed on the market, often with very to no little data on their toxicity. And we just, again, are not using any kind of alternatives assessment or substitution in our regulatory framework, never mind a lack of a product policy. One of the, sadly, a regrettable substitute, PFBA, was actually used as a replacement for us, as a CFC replacement, the destruction of the ozone layer, again through fluorochemicals. They switched to using PFBA, which of course did not destroy the ozone layer, but it now turns out to have very serious health impacts. And again, Grandjean's work is showing that this chemical accumulates in the lungs, which is increasing the severity of COVID infection in people that have higher levels of PFBA. Many of you will know that Quirks and Quarks has just finished 3 excellent episodes on PFAS in Canada. So you can hear him talk about this work that he's been doing. So who else is vulnerable? Well, if you have PFAS in products, you're going to have a PFAS waste problem, toxic waste problem. Considering these are forever chemicals, they don't degrade. They'll take hundreds, as people think, sometimes thousands of years for some of them. So what do we do with the landfilling of carpets, textiles, paper, and other household and industrial waste that is now generating releases of these chemicals to the environment? If you live near landfills, you are going to have air exposure. If you live near a wastewater treatment plant, you are going to have increased air exposure as well as discharge into the water systems. Note, however, that we do in Canada lack data, and we have no maps of the PFAS hotspots or PFAS hotspot contamination sites in Canada. So it's very difficult to know where these hotspots actually are, compared to the US, which has done a lot of data gathering and a lot of publicity on where these exist. Do safer alternatives to PFAS exist? Yes, on the whole. Certainly in firefighting foam, there's a lot of PFAS-free firefighting foam on the market. Food packaging material, a lot of movement to move away from any kind of PFAS for their oil and grease resistance. There's a lot of work happening on alternatives to PFAS and food packaging, but there's still things on the market. Testing done in the US found that McDonald's Big Macs were still using PFAS-coated paper. So there's a lot of market campaigns going on, brands. In the apparel and footwear sector, there's a lot of good innovation happening for durable water repellency. Even Gore-Tex is working on it. There's many products that are not used, that are PFAS-free on the market for the apparel and outwear sector. So each sector that's using PFAS knows that a day of reckoning is coming and there's a lot of good innovation, but there are alternatives on the market to move from product sectors that use PFAS. This is quite interesting. Last month, the European Union released their new chemical strategy for sustainability as part of their Green New Deal, and including the intention to phase out the entire class of PFAS. As they state, PFAS requires special attention, considering the large number of cases of contamination of soil and water, including drinking water, in the EU and globally, the number of people affected with a full spectrum of illnesses, and the related societal and economic costs, plus the fact that these forever chemicals are with us for decades, if not hundreds of years. The goal here is that PFAS will be phased out unless producers and users can defend an essential use of why that chemical is needed. So they're really putting the burden of proof back on users to dialogue under this concept of essentiality, which is substitution, but also, do you need it at all? And then finally, third example, perchloroethylene, good old perc. It's not really good old perc, but it's been around in dry cleaning, and I feel like I've been using this example for 20 years now. Perchloroethylene or perc and vulnerable populations. Well, of course, again, workers who use perc in dry cleaning, but also as a degreaser. And in fact, I know when I was looking at some of the MSDS from the women in Windsor who had 3 times the rate of postmenopausal breast cancer, they were using perc in some of the degreasing in those factories that they were working in. So it's used beyond just dry cleaning, but dry cleaning for sure. And the World Health Organization has classified perc years ago as a probable human carcinogen. Who else is a vulnerable community? Well, fence line communities, because if you have water or soil, but water contaminated with perc in groundwater and etc., is been found to be linked to leukemia and different types of cancers, pancreas, bladder, cervix, etc. But back to the dry cleaning workers, just in April this year, the US Environmental Protection Agency quoted that they found unreasonable risks, primarily neurological risks, because perc is known, this has been known for many years, decades, is known to attack the central nervous system, causing headaches, nausea, dizziness, and memory problems. Female dry cleaning workers have shown a risk of miscarriage 3 to 4 times above normal, and is known to contaminate mother's milk. So for consumers, there's also a risk, as the EPA says, of neurological effects associated with the skin exposure to clothes that you might bring back clean with perc, or it just could be also off-gassing in your home. And here's a sad little case study, is that we actually, it's a missed opportunity for informed substitution in Canada. When I was working on perc almost 2 decades ago now, I was happy to see that perc was declared toxic under SEPA, hooray. And in fact, Environment Canada did compile an extensive report on alternatives to perc. And the Canadian Centre for Pollution Prevention, which is now defunct, was dialoguing with dry cleaners on alternatives, on alternative non-perc solvents and technologies. So it looked like a really interesting, innovative time, but the outreach was halted. It didn't go anywhere. And the regulations, of course, continue to focus on reducing exposure to perc in just bringing in better perc recycling machines and exposure reduction. We have no municipal or provincial supported training or worker engagement on non-perc substitutes in Canada. We have some classes that give training to dry cleaners in Toronto, for instance. There's some mention of things like wet cleaning, but on the whole, there's no prioritization. Do safer alternatives exist for perc and dry cleaning and degreasing? Yes. And there's a long history of this work in California, Washington State, and Massachusetts, as well as New York, that give grants, training, and support for dry cleaners to understand the cost benefits of moving to non-perk alternatives such as wet cleaning. There's a lot of support, there's a lot of help, there's a lot of outreach. And without that, these dry cleaners would not have made the transition. So it's important that there's on the ground help, as Anne was raising with the nail salon workers. Who is going to do this on the ground work with them? So to sum up the way forward, just three things that I keep coming up with is that we need to put the substitution principle front and center in our chemicals management policy. It also just encourages innovation in safer chemicals use, and it will definitely be much better at protecting vulnerable populations. Regarding the innovation, we often hear from companies who are using these safer alternatives that they do what they do for various values, for various business opportunities, but they always say we need regulations so that our competitors are not, we need to raise the bar with regulations so that our competitors are not using cheaper and more toxic materials as competition against what we're doing. So if we don't put the substitution principle front and center, I would say that we are discouraging innovation in Canada. And then informed substitution at the federal level. I know we're talking about SEPA, but what does that mean for provincial and municipal level? How is that going to trickle down? Will it influence and change a focus on the rules we have at different levels of government? And I can't underscore this enough, is that the government needs to fund and give support to NGOs and groups like Anne's, and just really understand who the stakeholders are out there that are knowledgeable, have the connections, and can get out there and help do this transition. To do that, we also need to greatly increase transparency around decisions made around chemicals management, with big input and involvement from vulnerable populations, particularly when we come to looking at alternatives assessment. So my last slide is, what will happen now in Canada? The year is coming to an end. Are we going to see the kinds of recommendations that the Science Committee promoted on informed substitution? Are we going to see this mandatory duty to assess alternatives to ensure that decisions about how to regulate are based on information about substitutes? Are we going to see Canada mirror best practice internationally, as we see with the REACH framework and now with the new chemical strategy for sustainability coming out of Europe? Are we going to be laggards, or are we going to, raise the bar with best practice? And I just will say that Faye could talk about this more. I think there's an opportunity and maybe a proposal for some kind of a collective statement that we can send with clear goals for a new chemicals policy before the end of this year. So that's just an idea. And there, thank you for listening, and I'll hand it back to April.
Thanks so much, Bev. If you want to stop screen sharing now, Bev, perfect, thank you. I will just throw up our closing slide here to have in the background while we're taking some questions and answers. So let me just open this up. All right, great. Now I just need to grab my chat box back so I can see all of our great questions. So we have a lot of them in the chat box. I'm going to scroll back up to the beginning. So the very first question that came through, Anne, while you were speaking, actually, was, do nail workers think they have an increased rate of cancer? Is there any information about actual reproductive or developmental effects?
There's definitely a lot of information about developmental and reproductive effects. And was that Michael? Yeah, I'd be happy to send you a list of good resources on that. In terms of their understanding about increased risk of cancer, which there is, do they understand it? That, in the focus groups that we've done, there's talk of fear of cancer. And in the workshops that our outreach team do in the salons, there's a very direct addressing of the fact that, you know, certain of these chemicals have been linked to cancer, and the literature shows that there are higher rates of certain cancers among nail salon workers. There's so much else to absorb in the health information that I wouldn't say that that's a predominant concern. If anybody on the call wants to respond to this differently, please feel free. But I think, you know, some of them are just dealing with much more immediate things, like if you've contracted asthma or you're dealing with terrible skin problems or back pain or whatever, those more immediate concerns are what are up front. But it's definitely a topic of conversation that we introduce in a lot of our information work in the salons.
Okay, great. And then there were a number of sort of questions and comments that went back and forth between a couple of people following that. So I think some of those got answered, unless, Anne, you see something in there you particularly want to pull out.
There was a question from Dorothy Wigmore about, are they talking masks or respirators? For the most part, they're talking masks. We have been through in a whole set of educational tools that we have around respiratory issues. We've talked about, you know, the fact that respirators are preferable. But again, just to remind, it's you know, so prohibitive, so costly when they're already struggling just to keep their salons open. So we've kind of learned over time that there's certain things we just know we won't get much traction on because it's too costly.
Okay. And then if we scroll down a bit, there's a question there from Olga, which I think, Anne, is also directed to you. It's a lengthy one. Do you want me to read this out, or is it something you could summarize and ask? Do you see it? If not, I can read it out.
Yeah, if you could read it out.
Sure. So Olga says, on February 11th, 2015, Canada published its Hazardous Products Regulations, HPR, which modified its Workplace Hazardous Materials Information System, or WHMIS, to incorporate the globally harmonized system of classification and labeling of chemicals, GHS for workplace chemicals. Manufacturers or importers are now required to classify and label hazardous chemicals in accordance with the new GHS-based hazard communication system. How are these changes reflected in the work of nail salons?
Not from what we've seen. You know, I think we know how long it takes a lot of this stuff to trickle down. And once again, you know, if no one's enforcing it, it's not going to happen. So the short answer to that, Olga, I think is no.
Okay. And then there was a comment from Dorothy here that I'll just draw people's attention to around 135. And she gives a link for an informed substitution toolkit that she and Bev worked on with Larry Stoffman. And it's about cleaning and disinfecting products in workplaces, but can be applied to other chemicals and elsewhere. So it talks about green cleaning product alternatives.
Great work. And we're using it in what we're pulling together for the nail salon workers. It's really important for people to understand that cleaning is more important than is emphasized, that we're also drawn to products, you know, that will disinfect and kill, and when in fact soap and water often does the trick.
Okay, and then there was some conversation back and forth, and Anne, I think you weighed in the text about, or in the chat about this already, about the criminal law power and SEPA. Do you want to say anything about that?
I guess just to underscore, you know, thanks for raising it, Michael. It's just to underscore that so much of what comes out of the chemicals management plan, the decisions that are made there, the risk management plans, they have no teeth. And yes, we absolutely need to hold politicians accountable to this, because I think the level of ignorance about the role that the chemicals management plan plays is profound. And even amongst politicians, you know, that they aren't aware of just what that means when something is deemed toxic through the chemicals management plan, through an extensive process, and we still find it out there. It's still out there, right? So absolutely, there's a huge learning curve that needs to happen, not just amongst the public, but amongst politicians, you know, who should be making a stink in the House about how poorly this stuff is enforced.
Can I just add as well, this is Faye, the fact that Canada and specifically the Canadian Environmental Protection Act works with a risk-based approach, which means that, you know, controlling the greatest source of exposure has been the approach by the government. I think this needs to change if we are to better protect vulnerable populations from these types of exposure. And that speaks to, you know, the changes that need to be made to the federal legislation if we were to achieve that. And I think it's an important message. I think I heard both from Anne's presentation and certainly and Bev's presentation. And I think that's the reason why we wanted to use this opportunity, this webinar, is to put that different perspective and push on the idea of, you know, vulnerable populations are much more at risk from the impacts to exposure to these chemicals for a number of reasons, including the very, you know, category they belong to in those groups. So if we were to kind of push for a different approach that doesn't only look at, you know, managing the risk, but certainly moving towards that prevention, and using mandatory requirements like informed substitution, I think we're closer to being able to achieve that in theory and practice. Right.
Can I just address a question that Meg Sears posted, and then I'd really like Bev to take over, take the mic. It was regarding cancer and latency and how long nail salon workers work. This is part of the problem, of course, is that when someone gets sick enough and they can't stay with their work anymore, not necessarily from cancer, but the other range of health problems that they deal with, there's no follow-up. We don't know, you know, how many of them got cancer. There has, however, been some good work done in California that did look at nail salon workers who left the business and cancer rates. And the finding, because it was so hard, she really had to dig into some very deep data, but the finding was not, you know, wow, but we do know because of some of the cancers that they're dealing with have a long latency period, that not much of this just isn't getting reported. I think this is the same story with plastics workers in the auto industry, that because of the latency periods for some cancers, it doesn't show up. It doesn't get reported, isn't on anybody's radar screen. The connections, the dots aren't linked. Yeah, that's all I'll say about that.
Did you want to add anything to that, Bev?
Well, it drives me crazy when everyone's like, well, you know, what do we know about cancer rates? And you just need to look at the products that people are working with. I was shocked when I saw what the women in Windsor were working with. They were known carcinogens. Why are we not saying, why are they using these chemicals, and are there alternatives? You should just immediately pivot and say, what's a safer alternative? And how can we start to this transition? And yes, you know, Meg raises issues about how much data do we have, et cetera, et cetera. This whole sort of alternatives assessment will use the best data available on alternatives, but there will be times when the full information is not there. So then there's modeling, and then there's assumptions, and then there's different types of weight of evidence. And this is what the report from NRDC was pointing out, is that we need to be bringing that vulnerable population lens into that alternatives assessment much more than we are at the moment. But if you sit through some of the alternatives assessment work that's going on with companies, you know, big people like Unilever looking at new products, they go into massive depth. I mean, it's beyond nerdy to what the way that they're looking at the impact of the chemicals that they're designing or using. So it's there's a lot of expertise on how to address the whole alternatives assessment framework. But the point is that when there's evidence of harm, we should immediately be thinking about substitutes. And is that chemical necessarily in the first place? We're asking the wrong question way too late. We should be moving it as a priority. So this is why I just feel like without the substitution principle as the framework of SEPA, we're lagging far behind, because REACH brought it in and we've learned a lot from how that was implemented since 2007. And the fact that the EU has come up with something even more aggressive with groupings and phase outs and essentiality. Why aren't we moving down that track? And I'm hoping that what comes out later this year will not be a timid response, but bring us up to the 21st century here.
And Bev, you're getting a lot of support in the chat for your comments. And I think Toby said a similar thing in her comment. Why is something not required to be safe before putting it on the shelf instead of not having it be dangerous before it is taken off?
Well, this comes back to the burden of proof, right? Who's responsible for, you either have to defend that it's not a problem, or you have to defend that it's okay. So the burden of proof is something that is a whole other discussion. But the point I'm making is that we need to just say, if there's evidence of harm, what else is out there? How else can we serve the function of this? It's much more innovative that way.
Right. Okay, we only have a minute or two left. Anne, Bev, or Faye, were there any sort of top priority questions in the chat box that we didn't get to that you wanted to?
I don't know which one, April, I should answer, but I think I would like to provide the following commentary, which is, the intention of this webinar was to try to elevate the knowledge around what's happening in Canada at the moment with respects to hazardous substances and the potential challenges that vulnerable populations face when it comes to exposure. And that we have an opportunity over the next little while to, one, keep our government accountable to releasing a bill on SEPA. What we'd like to do based on this webinar is possibly develop, we want to develop a statement to highlight those points. And I think it's critical to do that now as opposed to later, because it allows for people to kind of digest what they've heard here and keep an eye for what the government's response is to a new bill on SEPA, which will amend it. And what we'd also like to do is to follow up to keep track of those the progress towards a better SEPA. And right now, informed substitution is not required under SEPA, but to make it work, as Bev said in her presentation, is that there has to be a mandatory requirement to do it. Right, that's the only way that you could achieve the elimination and prevention and shifting over from hazardous chemicals. If you don't have that element in SEPA, there's a lot of inconsistency in terms of an approach if you leave it to a sort of just a policy want within the government's approach. So I want to take that opportunity. I think both Bev and did a marvelous job of highlighting the challenges to vulnerable population, and I think we do have an opportunity in the coming weeks to, state our concerns around that with the federal government.
And I just want to add a PS to that vulnerable, to take Dawn's issue here about the ecosystem and animals. I didn't go, it's a mess for a lot of wildlife as well, but we were sticking to the definition of vulnerable populations regarding the human species. But totally take your point, Dawn. We have to think holistically about it. I just wanted to add that at the end.
Perfect. Okay, and so to your point, Faye, on our last slide that I have up here, Faye's contact information is on there. I've also included a SurveyMonkey link that's in the chat box as well. I would ask if you have a moment to just fill out a really short survey about today's webinar. And in there, you can also give us your name and email address if you want to stay engaged in this conversation. So there's that opportunity there. And then I've also dropped in the chat, just because it's easier to click than on the slide, links to our website. So we have one more webinar as part of this ongoing conversation coming up in 2 weeks. You do need to register for it separately. My apologies for some of the Zoom glitches that have happened in the last couple of weeks, but we've created a clean registration page for that webinar that's happening on, I want to say the 26th. I don't have my calendar in front of me. It says it on the screen. It's the 26th. And then lastly, there's a link there to CELA's webpage about the SEPA amendments that were proposed back in 1999, I believe. Any last comments from people? We're at 2:16, so we should be wrapping up, but any closing comments?
April, if I can just add that I put in a link for nail technicians. There are some on the call who are looking for support if you're not already familiar with it. A really great initiative out of the Parkdale Queen West Community Health Center and the Chinese and South Asian Legal Clinic is the Nail Technicians Network of Toronto. I put the Facebook page link, but if you can't find it in this long scroll,
just copied it.
Facebook. Yep. Go to Facebook and put in Nail Technicians Network Toronto.
Great. Thanks, Anne. Okay, well, I will say thank you very much to Anne and to Bev for speaking, and to Faye for organizing, and to all of you for hanging with us for almost an hour and 20 minutes today on this important topic. Thanks very much, and I hope we'll talk with you all again in a couple of weeks. Have a good afternoon.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.